Okay, welcome everybody to the first of our Valuing Nature Natural Capital webinar series. My name's Anika Weatherby. I'm the project manager for the Valuing Nature Programme Coordination Team, and I'll introduce today. I'd also just like to thank Victoria Barlow, who's working with the Valuing Nature team at the moment, for organising this webinar. So the format that we have for today then, I'll give a brief introduction to the Valuing Nature programme before handing over to our main speaker today, Rachel Stubbington, who's going to introduce her Natural Capital report. And we'll follow that with a question session. So Victoria will be fielding questions from the attendees. So if you have a question at all, please do type that into the chat box that you should be able to find on the interface, the GoToWebinar interface. You're welcome to type in those questions as we go along, and we'll pick those up at the end, and Victoria will put those to Rachel. So a quick introduction then to the Valuing Nature programme. This is a 5-year, £7 million investment from across 4 research councils and DEFRA, and it's particularly looking at these questions about how do we value nature, how do we make decisions about the natural environment that take into account the values that we see as human beings. So up on the slide here, we've got the summary. It's to better understand and represent the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analyses and to consider the wider societal and cultural value of ecosystem services. So you can see, although it's the programme is led from NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, we have funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Biological and Bioscience Research Council, as well as DEFRA. And part of our remit here is to really build understanding across those different areas of interest. We have 3 programme goals. The first is to build the Valuing Nature network, so to build the capability in the UK for working across these different disciplines and from these different user perspectives. So as part of that, we've been running the Valuing Nature Programme Coordination Team and running activities and events to help build that interdisciplinary understanding and to bring researchers together with people from the worlds of business, policy, and practice. So the kind of events we've been running are an annual conference. We've had a number of annual conferences now around the UK. We ran a placement scheme where people were able to go and work in a different discipline area or a different applied context. We've had a series of business engagement activities, including business impact scores, and we have our set of demystifying publications, where we try and dig into some of these complex issues and put them into very simple language that everybody can understand. As well as trying to build capability across that area, there are 2 sets of particular research projects that are listed here. The first are called Human Health and Wellbeing, and that's about understanding the value of our natural environment for human health, both physical health and mental health, and for wellbeing. And the second are in the area of ecosystem stocks and tipping points. And that's really about thinking about how we manage the landscape, how we understand those relationships between flows of ecosystem services and the benefits they bring to humans. If you're interested in finding out more about this, then you can sign up to the network if you haven't already. The website address is up there, and you can go and sign on to our Valuing Nature network, which will send you occasional newsletters. You can follow the work on Twitter as well. We have over 4,000 followers on Twitter. And just to draw to your attention, at the moment we're advertising on the website a workshop that we're running jointly with the Sustainable Intensification Research Network. And that's for early career researchers who want to increase their understanding of working across these different areas. There's a call open at the moment for a 3-day workshop in March, and the deadline is the end of this week, 28th of January. Moving on then to the natural capital synthesis reports. So natural capital is one of the big concepts in the area of valuing nature. And we felt that although it's going up a lot of policy agendas, there's still a need to bring the research together and to better understand what this approach means for users. So we ran a call last year for researchers to produce reports that summarize information and point out where the opportunities are, where the gaps are in our knowledge. And we were delighted to put together this set of 5 reports that are now all available on the website. And over the next few weeks, we're hosting webinars on each of these. Which brings us to today. So I'm delighted that we have Rachel Stubbington as the first of our speakers in this webinar series on the natural capital of temporary rivers. But just also to bring to your attention the rest of the webinar series. We're hearing on the 5th of February from Claire Lawson and Emma Rotherow about the natural capital of floodplains. The next day from Richard Payne on the natural capital trade-offs in afforested peatlands. Then a week later from Jess Davis and Victoria James Bassett on soil natural capital valuation, and particularly in agri-food businesses. And finally on the 19th, we'll hear from Rhoda Pritchard about her report on monetary natural capital assessment in the private sector. Okay, with no further ado then, I'll now hand over to the one and only Rachel Stubbington to tell us about her report on the natural capital of temporary rivers. And as I said at the beginning, please do type in your questions into the text box during the webinar so we can pick those up at the end. Okay, over to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Anita. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my webinar. So I'm Rachel Stubbington. I'm a researcher and teacher at Nottingham Trent University. And first, I'd like to start by thanking colleagues at the Valuing Nature programme for this opportunity to share our natural capital report. And second, of course, I must acknowledge my report co-authors, not least Judy England. So this webinar is to share insights from our report. I hope that I can convince you that natural temporary rivers and streams are aquatic terrestrial ecosystems that we should value for their natural assets and delivery of ecosystem services. So what are they? Well, as far as I'm concerned, rivers, the word river is synonymous with the word stream here. So temporary rivers and streams, they comprise channels in which water stops moving sometimes. And that's it. And that's all that you have to do to tick the box and be a temporary stream. And so technically, channels full of ponded water are temporary streams, as are high altitude streams, so cold streams, ones in which water sometimes freezes. But in most cases, we're talking about streams in which surface water is lost, leading to partial or complete stream bed drying. In some cases, they're dry for so long that it seems to me a bit bonkers to define them as freshwater ecosystems that sometimes dry. And surely streams that flow for just a few weeks or months a year are better thought of as terrestrial ecosystems that are sometimes inundated. But yes, regardless of such conceptual issues, and these are dynamic aquatic terrestrial ecosystems, and they dominate global river networks, and they're also common and diverse in places with cool, wet, temperate climates, so including the UK. Here, our temporary rivers, they do, yes, include those flowing over limestone bedrock. We've got our celebrated chalk streams, winter-born chalk streams of South England, but also flowing over karst limestone in the Peak District, for example. We've got bedrock-dominated rivers, peatland headwaters, icebound streams in the north of the country as well. Incidentally, be aware that as temporary stream scientists, we cannot agree on terms. So some people will refer to them as intermittent and or ephemeral rivers and streams, and we're all talking about the same thing, rivers in which water sometimes stops moving. So on to what on earth is natural capital? And I confess, I didn't know when I started the report, but my bad, needed to play catch up. This is now a widely used term in and beyond the UK. So according to the Natural Capital Coalition, it's the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. Right, I get it then. So by natural assets, we mean the physical assets, rocks, water, and landforms, and then we move on to biological assets, So these are all our bugs and fish, and not forgetting the microorganisms. So to paraphrase the World Forum on Natural Capital, as with financial capital, when we spend too much, we get into debt. And so here, when we exploit assets too much, we risk the capacity of ecosystems to sustain themselves. And so these sorts of analogies, these can make natural capital part of a language that enables me as a natural scientist to talk to other stakeholders. So an expected focus for the series of synthesis reports was the development of natural capital metrics to track progress towards goals for ecosystem service provision. But from the outset, we realised this would be quite ambitious for temporary rivers, because both in the UK and globally, we just don't know enough about their assets, and only some are well known. So in particular, there's a bias towards wet phase assets. For example, the provisioning, the cultural services of high quality water, of economically important fisheries, even rare invertebrates that only live in temporary streams. So we've got this wet phase bias, and compounding that wet phase bias. In the UK, both academic research and management activities have focused on wet phases, in particular ecosystems. So most attention has been paid to limestone rivers, in particular our winterborne chalk streams in the south of England, also the karst rivers in central England. So in contrast, mountainous and peatland temporary rivers are among those that are poorly known. Second, most research, most regulatory work has explored biological communities at local, within reach scales. So that looks the considerable contribution, it overlooks the contribution that temporary rivers make to habitat diversity and therefore biodiversity at catchment scales due to variability among sites. And finally, much research and management has focused on near perennial rivers that dry only during drought events. So these unpredictable disturbances. So that's contributed to the perception of temporary streams as symbolizing environmental degradation. Yes, naturally perennial rivers can dry due to water resource pressures, and those ecosystems certainly require management interventions to restore their natural flow regimes. But drought disturbances are natural, and drying is also the norm in many temporary rivers, even during non-drought years. So, the flip side of those previous two slides, where are our major research gaps? Or headwaters, this does depend on your definition of headwaters. Here, I'm referring to the most teeny and tiny of streams, the first order streams, in particular those in uplands. So they form extensive networks. They make a huge contribution to total network length, and we believe them to be hugely diverse in terms of both habitats and species. But they're really far away, right up out of public access, and so logistically these are more challenging to characterise and remain poorly known. There has been a recent drive, at least, towards recognition of the biodiversity and services of small water bodies, including temporary streams. So hopefully we're starting to see the tide turn. In addition, whole countries, whole regions remain poorly characterised. Once you get beyond southern and central England, there's so little UK research. We found one review briefly describing, oh, I love this, Scottish impermanent burns, they called them. We also found one 1958 study of a near perennial Welsh stream by some man called Hines, and no studies from Northern Ireland. I did email someone in Ireland to check but very little research beyond certain parts of England. So, oh yes, also, as I mentioned, we've focused on impacted systems, artificial temporary streams that only dry due to abstraction, whereas our naturally intermittent rivers are less well known. So perhaps the biggest research gap is the natural assets associated with dry channels. And it is quite odd until very recently, at the point at which a river loses surface water, and freshwater ecologists, and I'm certainly one of those, we've lost interest. We've wandered off in search for any remaining pool in which we can get an aquatic sample. But as we've wandered off, and the terrestrial ecologists, they haven't flocked in to take our place. So we've got this void, dry channels as a no man's land where both freshwater and terrestrial ecologists fear to tread. So we viewed them as devoid of life, but that's all lies. If we can actually start exploring these channels, we find that they support diverse communities, lots of beetles, including carabids, shown in that beautiful photo, and staphylids as well as plant communities. I've chosen a photo from an impacted reach there in terms of nutrient pollution, but they can also be diverse and abundant where dry phases are long enough. So our report, by necessity, we focused on natural assets and the major gaps in our knowledge of these assets. But we did use the limited evidence that we could compile to provisionally use a natural capital approach to link the bugs and rocks in temporary rivers, the assets, to economic value. So, for example, microorganisms, the assets, might have a functional role in cycling nutrients that delivers the service of water quality regulation, and people benefit from a supply of high quality water, and so we can place a financial value onto that supply. So to do this, to start exploring beyond assets, we looked at the current state of play. What do we know about the ecosystem services delivered by temporary streams? Well, during their flowing phases, and in particular temporary streams which have long flowing phases, we have started to quantify ecological processes. And so we've got these two rather exciting recent publications from the so-called 1000 Intermittent Rivers Project, which was led by Thibaut Datry, colleagues at Erstia Research Institute in France. And these studies give us some evidence that allow us to explore but not quantify ecosystem service provision during wet phases. And so wet phase services have been discussed as in these summary diagrams, and as in this paper by Datry et al. Just a couple of years ago. So they went through a comprehensive range of services and compared service provision during flowing, pool and dry phases. So this process was useful in describing how services differ during dry phases, but it didn't list any services that might be enhanced during dry phases or even unique to dry phases. So we have a go at doing that in our report. So I'm going to, it's all going to go horribly wrong now. I'm going to exit and take you to our report. And so we spent a lot of it going through these different assets, but then we came to the point at which we came to trying to link the assets to ecosystem services, and with a particular emphasis on services during dry phases. So we drew all these symbols to indicate different physical and biological assets, and then we mapped those assets. So the table there showing mapping of assets to services described in the UK National Ecosystem Assessments. So we included provisioning, regulating, cultural. And also we included services provided by freshwaters, but also those delivered by terrestrial ecosystems, such as woodland and farmland. And for each, we use black and grey symbols to indicate major and minor contributions to service provision, respectively. And those ticks, they indicate services for which provision based on limited evidence could be enhanced during or unique to dry phases. And then we've got these evidence boxes exploring a few in more detail. And so if we nip back to the presentation, there we go. And so just taking one example from each of the three major ecosystem service categories and starting with provisioning. And we suggest, yes, on the basis of limited published evidence from drylands in particular, and a bit of anecdotal UK evidence, we suggest that livestock and thus agricultural productivity may gain some benefits from temporary streams during dry phases. Firstly, as flow declines, depending on the flow regime, livestock may be able to safely access more drinking water resources. And in some temporary streams, water does remain in either connected or disconnected pools during an otherwise dry reach. And these may be increasingly restricted, but increasingly valuable resources during dry periods, if water quality remains good enough. However, in the UK, surely farmers, they can provide water for cattle at a minimal cost. And so perhaps the major benefit is the unique one, and plants. So as terrestrial plants come to colonize a dry channel, they could become abundant, more abundant in the surrounding land, which is drier and subject to more intensive management. So an additional grazing resource. And yeah, what evidence have I got? Can I put a price on its value? No, we need more research to explore these ideas. Onto a regulating service, and again, based on rather limited evidence, we do suggest that dry channels, the ones that once they're colonized by terrestrial grasses and herbs, it's likely to be that a dry phase occurs in summer during flowering phases. So they've got the potential to flourish due to higher moisture content in the channel, and so could be a valuable resource for insects that use aerial modes of pollination. Equally, regardless of the plants that establish, sediments could support ground-dwelling insects. I've no idea if tawny mining bees could be among those who colonize dry channels, but that's a beautiful photo there that I've taken from the Bug Life website. So finally, we move on to cultural services, and in particular recreation. And yet several recreational opportunities may benefit from the occurrence of dry phases. So firstly, walking and hiking opportunities could be enhanced. You've got the ability to enter a channel and use it as a navigation route. And what you can see on a riverside walk, that could be more diverse. And if a river comprises both flowing and dry reaches. So this Peak District leaflet from the Manifold Valley telling people to watch out for the rivers as they disappear beneath the surface. And finally, I love this idea that there are cavers who eagerly await dry conditions each year, and particularly dry conditions during drought, as they provide more opportunities to access more of a subterranean landscape. So, for example, in the Peak District, there are scheduled ancient monuments, so allowing a glimpse of the area's metal mining history. So, with that, I seem to be done. So again, I thank Victoria for arranging this session, and Anita and the Valuing Nature programme for the funding of support, and all of my co-authors. And if you're keen to learn more about temporary rivers, do feel free to contact me. You might like to follow me on Twitter. The @Smyers one is a big EU project about temporary rivers. And you might even like to pop to Nottingham Trent University's Clifton campus on the 25th of June for our 4th annual meeting focusing on these ecosystems. So hopefully now some of you will have questions for me.
We do indeed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Anita.
Marvellous. No, this is Victoria now. Hello, everybody. This is Victoria.
Hello.
So I have a question from Chloe Hayes, and she asks, how will climate change impact on temporary streams and their services?
Oh, that's a huge question. And the evidence is actually really patchy. And so it does depend on region. In some regions, I think we can say definitely extremity is going to increase. And so droughts are going to increase, and therefore dry phases. We might have near perennial systems that dry more often. We might have longer, drier dry phases in currently intermittent streams. And so we are in many regions likely to see a shift towards greater provision of terrestrial ecosystem services, and that's going to require careful management to ensure adequate representation of the freshwater ecosystem services. So that's a big question from Chloe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a question here from Judy England. The question is, which is the key research gap we should address?
I think, and I am a bit obsessed with this, so apologies for any bias, but I do think it's the dry phases, the fact that it's seriously only in the last few years, 5 years mainly, that anyone has started to characterize the communities, the terrestrial communities and the persistent aquatic communities that they support. So we need to be not only characterized in them, but working out what should they be like in unimpacted conditions. How do they differ at sites that are exposed to human pressures such as nutrient pollution, and so informing the activities of our regulatory agencies in managing these ecosystems. Thank you, Judy. I can't hear anyone at the moment.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. I do apologise.
No.
The next question is from Deborah Dunsford, and she asks, did you identify any important ecotones in brackets transition zones?
We did not, and yet I think they are definitely there. And so we have learned a lot from colleagues at Natural England, in particular John Webb, in terms of riparian communities. And so, thinking about temporal and spatial transitions, will a spatial ecotone gradually move towards the centre of a channel as the dry phase progresses? I think that's a particularly interesting research gap, and I think we have a lot to learn from, colleagues studying riparian zones. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Anika France. It's a long one. Should we really be promoting the access of livestock to ephemeral streams? Livestock access to watercourses causes a huge number of impacts, such as bank erosion and sediment and nutrient inputs. Organisations such as the Rivers Trusts and Environment Agency spend millions nationally to try and prevent this with fencing and alternative drinking sources. Thank you, Anika.
That is me told, and rightly so. That's a really important point. So thank you, Anika. I think, yes, as we start to explore ecosystem services, that we are going to then, be contemplating, yes, new social decisions. And as with perennial streams, we need to manage access. I guess for that ecosystem service, I am thinking globally, as well as, yes, in the UK, in terms of the balance of social factors that need to be built into decision making. But no, quite right. We need to be very careful to ensure that any access is sensitively managed.
Okay, thank you. And a question from George Bunting. Is there anything to learn from the rest of the world regarding how best to manage these types of streams in the UK?
There is. There's a group in the Mediterranean led by the Catalan region of Spain. There's the T Rivers, Temporary Rivers Project, a life-funded project, and they are ahead of the game in terms of managing these streams. It's intriguing talking to colleagues, for example, in Portugal. They don't call temporary streams. They just call them streams because most of their ecosystems have intermittent or ephemeral regimes. And so we can look at how the ecosystems are being managed, in particular, whether or not, well, for example, whether or not a biological index developed for perennial streams during flowing phases, if it also works in a temporary river during flowing phases. Can we use such indices in order to characterize the health of temporary rivers, or do we need to develop new indices to do so? So yes, Mediterranean colleagues and also in areas of California, they are ahead of us in some respects, and we have much to learn. Thank you, George.
Thank you for that. So the next question is from Christopher Templar. He asks, is there appetite from DEFRA to pay landowners for providing eco-services such as temporary rivers?
I think that one is beyond my area of expertise. I suspect, however, that we're a little far removed. We first need to do more to better characterize the communities in these systems and how they differ between wet and dry phases. I think we could be a few years before we're able to engage with those major stakeholders. And although that's, yes, huge, it's hugely important that academics are collaborating with environment agency stakeholders at the moment, as well as Natural England. But I've yet to engage with anyone from DEFRA. I hope that as we build more of an evidence base, we'll be better placed to do so.
Thank you. Okay, so now I have a question from Tom Durbin. Do you feel the same application of an ES approach could be applied on temporary flow routes, in brackets, rather than ephemeral watercourses, that are a result of runoff in the landscape before entering a watercourse? And do ask if you want me to repeat the question.
Yes, I'm not quite understanding that one.
Okay. So do you feel the same application of an E-S approach could be applied on temporary flow routes rather than ephemeral watercourses that are a result of runoff in the landscape before entering a watercourse?
And we could have an issue with the different terminology used here, because I would view temporary streams as, any ecosystems that dry, and the ephemeral ones as those that have just got flashy, unpredictable flow regimes. So, as Tom mentions, surface fed in some cases and responsive. So I'm still not quite understanding the question. So Tom, you're welcome to email me. But I think that it raises an important point that, for example, when I'm mentioning that Catalan colleagues in Mediterranean regions are ahead of the game, that's in terms of the intermittent rivers, which are defined as those which have got predictable flow regimes. So the ephemeral streams and rivers with unpredictable and flashy regimes, they do require a different approach. In terms of managing the flow regimes in particular, these are challenges that are being picked up by Working Group 1, the hydrological working group, in the cost action that I mentioned about, yes, the science and management of intermittent rivers and ephemeral streams, the SMIRES network. I hope that that might at least start to help. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you. And then we now have a question from Deborah Dunsford. Do we know about the resilience of the key defining features of this ecosystem, both to natural and man-made, e.g. flood risk? So about the resilience of the key defining features.
We know about the resilience of the communities, but I think Deborah's asking.
Oh, sorry,
about...
I missed off a bit of the end of it, actually. It says both to natural and man-made, e.g. flood risk management, abstraction, etc.
I think, yes, we're starting to explore the communities and find that individual communities can be characterized by resistance, so the ability to withstand a disturbance, or resilience. So in particular in cool, wet places such as the UK, ecosystem resilience is promoted by, in many cases, the close proximity of perennial reaches. But I think we do need to be quite careful, because there's likely to be thresholds, tipping points, at which, yes, if a dry phase increased in length, then we could be looking at a system no longer being able to sustain itself. But in general, in a natural temporary stream that's without the spectre of climate change or human altered flow regimes, then we are, these ecosystems, they are characterized by communities with high resilience in some cases, the ability, they're used to disturbance, and they are good at recovering afterwards.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So I now have a question from Ingo Shuddha. Says, Rachel, great talk, thank you. Now that we start establishing / quantifying ESS / demonstrating the value of their natural capital, how could we use this to make a case for investment in their protection / regeneration?
I like that question. So I think the key thing that I need to do as an academic is to engage with stakeholders, and so colleagues at the Environment Agency. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I can, hold on. Now that we start establishing / quantifying ESS / demonstrating the value of their NC, how could we use this to make a case for investment in their protection / regeneration?
Right, so how we can make a case for their protection.
Yeah,
I think I'm going to start getting repetitive now, because I think we need to go back to defining that we need to realise that with temporary streams, we are at such an early stage in some respects, and I'm going to mention it again. This is in particular in terms of describing some of their communities, their terrestrial communities. So I think, first of all, yes, we do need to better characterise the natural biodiversity, and yes, there are many studies now. That's a lie. There's a handful of studies that are quantitatively demonstrating that temporary rivers, when we consider how they vary in space and time, that their total biodiversity contribution it can be as high or higher than perennial rivers. I wonder if, in terms of making a case for their protection, we should also look for some flagship species, some icons. So I adore that mayfly that I showed a picture of. It's Paroleptophlebia werneri, and I think it's gorgeous. But I wonder if many other managers would consider that to be a valuable species, simply on the base of its rarity and association with temporary streams. And so we could look to highlight some key services. So, for example, there's evidence that salmonids benefit from the clean gravels in temporary streams. Can we use some of those more iconic species to really highlight that these ecosystems aren't impacted? Perennial rivers, they have their own conservation value. Thank you, Ingo.
Okay. So I'm just going through so that I make sure that we aren't repeating questions or duplicating. So this is a question from Frank Tarkovsky. You noted that developing matrix for these types of natural capital assets is complex. Is there any scope to standardize any of the services you described in order to track and achieve goals, say in the 25-year plan for the environment?
I think there is potential to develop metrics, that we have some quick wins. So we can, there's potential for some biomonitoring indices, some biological indices to be evaluated and adapted. And there's also potential for using simple measures based on richness, for example, taxon richness or functional metrics that recognize the traits of organisms. So there is potential to learn from other ecosystems and to create these metrics for tracking progress towards service goals. I think I've only partly addressed that question. Oh, I wish I could see them. So do you want to remind me of any aspects that I haven't covered well?
Let me just see, sorry.
It might be useful though, mightn't it, if we do?
I have got them all. We have got them all written down and recorded. So maybe what we can do is when we have completed this webinar, anything that you feel you haven't adequately responded to, you can do so by email. I think that's
sure.
possible. And we can contact those individuals through the webinar registration.
But Frank's
process.
comment has just made me think that yes, if we can start to use these quick wins to actually quantify, look, these ecosystems are, yes, providing habitat for X species, or there's X change, and that might be really useful in terms of the longer goals towards their protection.
Sure.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. So I think there's just a few more questions. One from George Bunting. As there is so much we don't know about temporary streams, is there anything you've come across during your research so far that has been particularly surprising?
Oh, wow. For me, it's going to have to be those initial look-sees at the dry channels. Oh, and I love the idea that not only in the dry sediments, so we can dig up dry sediments and rehydrate them. And we can, yes, I've rehydrated a lot of sediments in my time. And one experiment that I just accidentally left running during the winter and into the following spring. And when I finally looked at those previously dry sediments that have been rehydrated, stonefly nymphs had emerged. So I think it's fascinating the extent to which aquatic communities can persist within drying sediments. And equally, I love the idea that we could find inundation-tolerant terrestrial taxa. We know them from, for example, floodplains in Brazil, but we don't yet know them from the temperate streams of temperate zones. But I wonder if they're out there. There is one study by Elisa Stewart and colleagues that suggests maybe there are unique terrestrial assemblages in dry channels. Thank you, George.
Then we move on to a question from Katherine Sefton. What do you see as the big challenges in monitoring these systems to provide data to address the research gaps? So I don't know if you've answered a bit of that question already, but...
Oh, no, but I know Kath's a hydrologist, and so immediately I'm thinking about gauging stations. So the very limited extent of the gauging stations, and that I know Kath's research is developing some really innovative techniques in order to be able to map spatial and temporal variability in flow regimes in temporary streams. And yes, when do they dry, and over what extent? But I think upscaling these initiatives is a huge challenge, even if you do correctly characterize a natural flow regime at one point in time. How much of a reach does that actually represent? And so I think, yeah, I really have an ecological focus, but at the base of that, we need to better understand the natural flow regimes and their diversity. Thank you, Kath.
Okay, thank you, Kath. And then we've just got time for one more question. And anybody else that has asked questions that haven't been answered, I think there's just a few more at the end, we will get back to you. And so the question's from Richard Chad. And it is, how close do you think we are to having regulatory bodies, e.g. EA, undertaking dry phase monitoring?
I think we could be a little way off. I think that our first priority needs to be to characterize those communities. At the moment, we don't know what an unimpacted dry channel terrestrial, so for example, the Caribid communities of unimpacted temporary streams. We don't know. We need to know how they vary in space, and we also need to know how they vary in time. So, for example, before we proposed a biomonitoring index, we'd need to identify the best time window. So, for example, well, yeah, the flip side is during flowing phases. Our Mediterranean colleagues have identified that you need to wait a certain amount of time before you go sampling during a wet phase in order to characterize the peak diversity. And equally, we need to start exploring dry phases to work out, yes, not only what can we sample to identify or to characterize responses to different impacts, but also when should we take those samples. And yeah, we're likely to need a range of biomonitors for a range of different impact types. So we've got a lot to do, and it's hugely valuable having the close collaboration and the real interest of regulatory partners in developing that research. Thank you, Richard.
That's great. And Anita here again. Thank you so much, Rachel, for so fielding all those questions. My big take-home message here was the quote you gave us, which I hope we're going to change, that dry channels are a no man's land where freshwater and terrestrial ecologists fear to tread. Well, I hope we've managed to change that idea.
Let's change that.
No man's land
Let's
anymore.
tread in them.
Thank you so much for sharing that report and setting up the challenges there. Thanks so much, Victoria, for fielding all those questions and sharing those. And thank you to everybody who's attended. If you haven't already downloaded the report from the website, please do. And Rachel's contact details are still up on the screen, so please do feel free to send her any further questions.
Indeed. Thank you.
With that, we'll end the webinar. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.